It's a pleasure to be here, not least because Chigozie is a dear friend. He's come to Boulder before some years ago, and I really respect his writing. I'm from India, so he's in America. Writes authentically about Africa. And yet it is a completely universal story that he tells that could be, except for the context, be anywhere in the world. This book, well, Chigozie has been referred to as the heir to Chinua Achebe. Chinua Achebe was the greatest African writer in the canonical sense of it. And I think it's because Africa is such a large continent with huge oral histories, with stories that are not told, and sometimes the stories that we encounter in other countries, like in the UK or America, the United States, they are stories which are told by the next generation who has heard the stories from their parents or their family, and they've not grown up with the sound and smell of their mother country. But you have had a childhood, a very rich and fascinating childhood in your home country. So there is a feeling of the soil in them. I'm not going to indulge in a lengthy introduction. I'd much rather you get a sense of his new work, which is called The Road to the Country, because he's going to talk about it this session. We'll also talk about his other books and the context of those books, but we are talking about The Road to the Country, which is, can you show it to them?
Yeah, they might see a different cover. This is the British edition. I just prefer to read from this.
Yeah, it's the Indian edition also, so I read it. Now, The Road to the Country is Chigozie's third novel. It follows the success of his previous books, The Fisherman and The Road to the Country, both of which were shortlisted for the Booker Prize. This is a magisterial book, which means it takes a look, it almost has a larger vision of the landscape and the individuals in that landscape, though it is more about one person who's going through it, but you also get a complex story of the whole process of a war. We are going through 2 wars at the moment in the world, and we just read the headlines. But behind the headlines is so much hurt, pain, devastation of individuals, so much untold bravery and courage. And bravery and courage for what? Because in the end, families are destroyed, people are destroyed. And I cannot help but compare this book to Tolstoy's War and Peace, which looks at that whole thing of what happens to a society when it is under siege. Except that here it is a civil war, and it's a country which is at conflict with itself. May I, Chigozie, request you to read a passage, something that takes us into the very heart of the book and its linked themes. If you could place this also when you introduce your passage in the context of the Biafran War, the civil war which rent Nigeria asunder in the years 1967 to 1970. I'm old enough to have remembered at that time the headlines of the Biafran War and the photographs. And please tell us about the context of the book and read a passage in whichever order you like.
Okay. Thank you very much, Namita. I respect this woman a lot. She's like my literary mom. Let me put it that way. I would say that my interest in the war was actually piqued. Maybe I should begin with that, more of a personal story, by an encounter that I had in 1993. So I was born in 86, which is like about 16 years after the war ended. So it took place 67 to 70. So then in 1993, Nigeria kind of came apart again. There was a constitutional crisis. So Americans often like to think of dictatorship. 1984 is always quoted as a text, as an attack text when you want to like have political arguments. But I actually grew up in a country where we actually had 1984. You know, 2 times growing up, I remember the 1992 event very vividly. It was about 4 a.m. and the radio came on, the transistor radio, and there was this very deep voice. You know, everyone was awakened, of course, by my parents. And the guy came on the radio. It was a national broadcast. And he said, ladies and gentlemen, I am General Sani Abacha. I am now the new leader of the country. The constitution is abolished. The parliament is abolished. You know, he threw out the entire law, and then he became the ruler. If you thought he was joking, well, the next morning there were tanks in the streets. Martial law had been declared. And for the next about 4 years, that would be the reality of Nigeria. So, but under pressure, you know, the US, the UN, other powerful countries were like putting pressure. Oh, you know, you have to have democracy. So reluctantly, this guy declared an election. And then he had a proxy who was running as sort of a candidate. The other guy who was more popular won the election. But then the junta, of course, annulled the results. And then Nigeria was thrown into a constitutional crisis. So my parents at the time were very fearful of what that could lead to. So they woke up one morning, you know, and my mom was like, you know, everybody get in the car. So we did this long trip to the eastern region, the old Biafran enclave, for the first time. So I'd grown up in the city. This was my first time in an actual village. So in African villages, it's very communal. Everyone knows everyone, you know. So the following morning, we had all these relatives coming up to say hello. And I noticed something. At the time, I was a very curious kid, very curious. In fact, I got more punished for asking questions than anything else. So I noticed that quite a number of the people who were coming to say hello had some form of disability and deformities. There was a man who was wheeled on a wheelchair and he had no limbs. His legs were gone. And there was a lady with one hand. And there was this woman whom I will not forget. She was probably like in her early 20s. But half of her face had been eaten up by something. She was in fact scary to me, you know, as a little boy. And I remember going to my mom and being like, Mom, what happened to these people? And she said to me tersely, because she didn't want me to bother her, she said, Obaga. That was, the translation would be, it was the war. And that was it. You know, I knew I wasn't going to get anything out of her. So that's the kind of thing that gets seared into your consciousness and never leaves. So that was my first encounter with the war. So of course, growing up, I wanted to understand what this war was that left its physical imprints on the bodies of these people. And I think that's what led to this novel. But a very quick, brief history. Nigeria was formed, the idea of Nigeria was formed in 1914 by, mostly it was a single idea actually by a British sailor who was put in charge by the British to look over the West African territories that they had annexed. So he had this brilliant idea that there should be a country. And then he brought his girlfriend in, and they did, you know, he delegated her with naming the country. So his girlfriend actually came up with the name Nigeria. She played around with Nigeria because of the river Niger. So the dalliance between these two lovers actually created Nigeria. So what tends to happen in a country like that is that, you know, my dad would say that his own parents were Nigerians, but they never knew that they were Nigerians until they died. Of course, they weren't consulted. So the decision was made in London. and then we had to bear with the repercussions. So what led to the war is that Nigeria was created, and then as post-colonial countries often is, if you look at the formation of nation states like France or Sweden, for instance, in general, there was already a sense of national identity, or at least we're Swedes. There's in fact a Swedish language. Then you form Sweden, But the reverse was the case. Nigeria was already formed. Then you had to do the work of becoming Nigerians. So that was actually what happened. 1966, the British are kicked out. And then now what? What is this country? We have now to become Nigeria. So, there was a lot of debates. What should being a Nigerian look like? The British, who had these bright ideas, of course, had gone. So it led to a lot of disputes, and that's what led to the war. The novel has tried to chronicle those events between 1966 to 1970. And my main character is Yoruba. He's not from, his mom is Igbo, but he has no cause in the war. He's dragged into it and conscripted. So this is a crucial moment in the novel, when he actually, as you realize when I read, something major happens to him. So I'll read from that. It has taken some time, but it occurs to Kunle that he's been existing in the significance of his own presence, like a thing without anchor. And now he begins to see things, a refracted light spreading across a distant plain, its reflection brightening the face of this world. On a track that runs as far as the eye can see, beings are floating in different directions. And from somewhere comes a toll of some unearthly bell, so loud and overwhelming, it feels as though he's been plunged into the core of the sound itself. He claps his hands over his ears and steps away from the place. And when he cannot longer hear the bell, he looks about, and the horizon spread as far as the eye can see is covered in painterly rows of purplish blue light, as if it were an imagined world, something in a picture book. Again, he wonders, what is this place? He searches for any trace of what the place might be, and where is Agnes? The front, his comrades, the war. Well, he's covered in dirt, leaves, blood, and mud, and there are cement stains beneath the zipper and on the legs of his trousers. His heart leaps at this. Has his comrades seen them? He thinks that the stains must come from one of those daring times, these past few days, when he made love to Agnes hastily in some patch of the bush, in the midst of some shelling. Every time Kunle touched her, he felt his soul descend a secret stair into a bunker, sheltered from all the torments of war. He notices now that his right boot has been torn, and he can see the top of his foot, and the rest of it is rubbed in dust. His trousers are so dirty and caked with flecks of mud, he wants to take them off and wash them. He hears a distant cry, and he turns about, and his eyes scan the undulating stretch of hills as far as the eye can see. But nothing stirs nor makes a sound. And when he moves, his feet produce a sound that echoes and tumbles into some vast, endless void, and sets off little muffled detonations of sound all around him. It becomes clear to him now that this place is not of the world which he's come to know all his life. Here, one's footstep echoes and occupies space, and what one sees becomes a thing that is irrevocably seen, and whose form soon changes. Yet he feels whole, alive in some mystic way. He becomes conscious of some change, a growth of the mind, as of a child coming into the recognition of new things. And this realization alarms him. He's dead. In the time it takes for this thought to take shape, he finds that the place has changed too, and that the world that only a moment before was hesitant to come into being has suddenly become fully realized. Figures like him are scattered all over the plain, all gazing at themselves first, then at this place. And amongst them are two Biafran infantrymen, standing on a terrace path beside a large pot containing some colorful plant. He motions at once towards them, but before he can move, the bell tolls again.
This is a very intriguing passage from the book where he talks about the limbo between life and death, from where Kunle emerges as the rarest of mankind, an Abami Ida, one who will die and return to life. And I want to combine two questions here for you to tell me those. First of all, because they are linked, these questions, tell us about the inner sources of the interwoven stories of the seer's vision. There's a seer, like a prophet, who frames the story, and the Ifa bulls and the relentless progress of the war. So that's one. And linked to that is the question of the Igbo community being a part of your identity and narrative context. Tell us about the concept of Chi, the guardian spirit, the spark of the divine within the self. How and where does it appear in the road of the country? What is the role of the seer in understanding the prophecies of Ifa's vision? And you'll have to explain to them what is Ifa's vision. It's a book, people are very afraid to write these things, but he has written a very powerful passage here about the line between life and death. In the war front, when somebody thinks he's dead, people give him up for dead, but he's not.
Well, it's a lot of multifaceted questions. I think I'll start with the limbo that you speak of. My consciousness, I think, is shaped by, I would say, a variety of things. But I would like to locate the structures that I often have in my novels. If there's any reason why, they've gotten some attention, I think it's usually because of those structures, I would say, at least in my opinion. Like An Orchestra of Minorities is a novel that is narrated by the Chi. So the Chi in my name, for instance, or Chinoa or Chimamanda, Igbo names Chinaza. It's this spirit, this index of divinity that the Igbo people believe, and so is everyone. And I think that belief is central to the Igbo, not just religion, which I'm fascinated by, but also tradition and cosmology, which was why I wrote my second novel. I mean, it's easy to dismiss beliefs like that as just mythology or folklore or something like that, but it wasn't so. It actually was institutionalized. So these are some of the foundational beliefs that are realized in institutions. And I'll give you an example of what I mean. When the British first came to my part of Africa, it was quite easy in the north of Nigeria, for instance, to install a sort of British divide and rule system there. The reason was because there were centralized governments. You just went to the emir and the palace of the emir or the sultan or something, and with your canons, and they either surrender their sovereignty or fight. Those are the two choices. But when they went to the east of Nigeria, with the Igbo place, it was very difficult because the Igbos, if you've read any of Achebe's work, for instance, the Igbos had no monarchical system, no centralized government. So what we had was a sort of an egalitarian structure where the oldest people in society, in a village or a town, made the rules. So they came together and agreed. So it was very fascinating for the British. So they go to like a town, and where is the palace? There's no palace. In fact, the people were laughing at the British. Oh, you have a king, you have a queen, ha 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 ha. And the reason for this was, if you believe that everyone is divine, is ensouled by a chi, then how can you say that by virtue of being born into a family, then you predominate over others? So it didn't make any sense to them. So I tap a lot into this belief system and try to combine it, of course. I'm westernized. English is my first language. I'm educated in a quasi-British educational system, you know.
And Shakespeare has been an influence in your life.
Yes. So there's a blending of that. But what I've tried to create, I think, over 3 novels is a blending of the mystical and the realism. You know, so the Fisherman, for instance, people would say that it's a sort of magical realism work. But I always would challenge, I had this discussion with a Danish journalist whom I really would become good friends. And I'm like, okay, you've written this whole article about magical realism in this book. Can you tell me one magical act in the book? And he couldn't find any. So, but what happens is there is a spiritual dimension. So there's a prophecy that is given. It's a spoken word. And it has sort of a physical manifestation in the lives of those to whom it's given. So that's why I rely a lot on prophecy. So the same thing here. So even though the war, we followed the war from its beginning to the end, 1967 to 1970, the novel actually is, we see the whole thing through the eyes of a seer who actually has this vision of the future during one night in 1947. So Nigeria is not even independent yet. It's 20 years into the future. And he has this entire vision. So that by the time he finishes the vision, he begins to doubt it himself. Because he goes out and the British Union Jack is everywhere. So what is this country that he has just seen unravel, 20 years into the future? So what ends up happening is, I hope that the reader becomes even doubtful. This stuff I've just read, is it true? So even though Biafra is a historical fact, it happened, one of the most devastating conflicts of the 20th century. Between 1.5 million to 2 million people died in the war, In fact, some analysts like the American Kurt Vonnegut says that more small weapons were used in it than the Second World War combined, rifles, grenades, and stuff like that. So yet, when you finish reading a novel, it becomes like a warning, like something that hasn't yet happened that can be prevented. So that's where that structure comes in. And the reason why he has to die and go to this space thing.
Because there is so much that is universal. We all wonder what happens after we die. And this man almost dies, but not quite. He gets a glimpse between the shadows and the curtains of life. Now, one more question. The epigraph in the beginning of the book quotes an Igbo proverb that says, "The story of a war can only be fully and truly told by both the living and the dead." And I think that's really true. Even in India, where we had the largest mass migration in history in the partition, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, those stories didn't come out immediately. It took time for the next generation to process the enormity of what has happened. So here, you've written about a generation before you were born. It's an enormous and meticulous act of documenting and archiving. The persistence of memories also involves some distortions, some deceptions. How have you balanced your historical vision with writing the story of your main character?
So I faced a very serious problem when I decided to write this novel. It wasn't the novel that I planned to write, actually. It did change. So I realized, again, as I said, I became very curious, even obsessed with the Biafran War as a result of that encounter as a child. But I think by 2020, around the pandemic, was when I read insanely, a number of books. And then I realized something. I probably had covered everything that had been written about the war up until that time. And what I found surprised me, there was there were preponderance of non-fiction books, accounts, historical books, memoirs, usually by survivors and non-combatants. And then there were some novels, works of fiction. But they were usually, I had to make a category, wartime novels. Half of a Yellow Sun, for instance, which you mentioned. What I didn't find were war novels. And by which I mean books, fictional work in which the fighting is not background, is central. It seemed to me as if nobody wanted to engage with that. So, I thought, okay, well, I will do that. So immediately I faced very serious problems. And one of the problems was that I know it's a cliche that nobody wants to talk about wars, but the Biafran War is its own beast in this regard, because almost nobody wanted to speak about it. An example was I was on the phone with a friend of mine in New York. She's about 40, and her dad had read 2 of my novels, and she says to him, hey, he's writing a 3rd novel, and it's about Biafra. And he got on the phone and began to talk to me. And he was saying all these very interesting details. And I was like, sir, how do you know these things? And he confessed that he joined the Biafran army at 19. And his daughter has known him, they're very close. And that was the first time she ever heard that her dad was in the war. The man never mentioned it. There's stories like that. My dad's best friend, the same thing. He's known him for 30 years. He was shocked when the man, while drunk, confessed that he'd fought in the war. So one day I went to my mom, during this visit in 2018, and I'm like, okay, you were, a young woman at this time, and your home was bombed. Can you say about the war? Your 2 brothers fought in the war. Your uncle died, and she wouldn't say anything. Then at some point, I'm like, okay, you know what? I will write this novel whether you like it or not. So she says to me, okay, well, so she doesn't speak English very well and cannot read. But she has this very anthropological knowledge because she grew up in a village. And she said something, which is the epigraph you read earlier. She said, you know what, if you are going to write about the war, then you have to write it the proper way. I'm like, Mom, what do you mean by that? And she said, usually when people tell stories of wars, it's never complete nor true. Because war produces a preponderance of dead. Yet those who tell the stories and about whom the stories are often told are the living. So she said, if the story of a war is not complete nor true, if it's not told by both the living and the dead. So I took that as a challenge. So how do you involve the dead in the narration of this novel? So that's what you get in that section I read. So of course, Kunle is killed by shrapnel halfway through the novel and has a sort of a near-death experience. But he's thrown into this midst of this crowd, this carnival of stories where at the same time you have Vietnam going on. So American soldiers, one of them is an African American, who has just been killed. And he's in this same space and is crying for his mom. You have, I would say that the world actually went mad around that time because there's conflict in, there's conflict in the Middle East at the time too. So you have, Israeli soldiers who are just killed and all of that stuff. So I also wanted to put the Biafran War in a sort of a global context at the time. But that's where the structure, the idea of that epigraph comes from, because I thought what my mom said was actually true, and I wanted to realize that in the novel.
As you can already see in the audience, you've heard him, and you would believe it when I quote from The Guardian, which says, the novel is not for the faint-hearted. It is a brutal book. Yet it ends with love and hope and reconciliation. Tell us about the narrative shift of mood, which carries pain and resignation, and then also towards the end of the book, you reassert the human capacity for joy. Tell us that movement, which I found very moving, because I was finding it exhausting to read, yet compelling. And then suddenly the clouds clear up.
I'll say that one of the things I learned about, war itself, because I was very immersed in it, it can be almost, it's both enlightening to the mind, also somewhat emotionally destructive to embed yourself in all that history. While doing the research, not the novel itself. Because I read widely, even wars, Second World War and stuff like that, to understand the psyche of the frontline soldier and the civilians and all of that. So, but one paradox is that war actually brings out the worst in people and the best in people at the same time. There's a point in the novel where one of the comrades, Kunle's comrades, says something like, I can't quote correctly now because I never read my novels. Namita, you've read all my books. I'm jealous, but I've never read any of them. He said something like, before the war, we had these dreams that were huge. We wanted to be doctors. We wanted to be lawyers, professors, and whatnot. We wanted to have money and make impact in the world. But the war is an equalizer. And now our dreams are flattened. And everyone just wants to survive. So we're all on equal footing. So at that point, who can be selfish when there's nothing to gain?
And hope has been taken away.
Exactly. So you become selfless. And that's what happens. So the war actually does transform Kunle. He's a very insular character at the beginning of the war. And, he's dragged into this thing that he doesn't know anything about. And the war reforms him. He becomes a selfless man who at some point actually has the opportunity to leave Biafra, but stays back because of his comrade and the woman he's falling in love with, his Agnes, his comrade. So it's a sort of reformation through, a sort of regeneration through violence.
Regeneration.
Yes.
I've just got a signal from them that we have only 10 minutes left.
Okay.
So I think we'll skip that last reading. I have at least 3 or 4 questions, which you and I will discuss in person. But I think this is the time to throw it open to the audience for any questions they may have. If you are still thinking about the questions, I've got a few lined up. Any hands up for anything which you've gathered from a book which I guess you haven't read yet, but I think you must have got a sense of it by now, and about the war. If you could give the...
Thank you.
Thank you. And now, after your explanation, I have to go back and read The Fisherman again. Thank you for that. My question is, given how the same divisions that were tearing Nigeria apart in the 60s still exist and in some ways have gotten worse, and then this concept of the uncles and your grandfathers not discussing the thing, what reaction have you gotten from other Nigerians who've read the book, either those in the southeast or from other regions of Nigeria?
It's a great question. I'm supposed to do an African tour next week, but I've had to cancel due to some family pressures. But it's been surprisingly well reviewed there. Obviously, because of my last 2 books, I do get, relatively good media attention back home in Africa, but of course in Nigeria especially. And what I find interesting about the reception so far is that, people use it for different purposes. There are some people who are calling for the reenactment of Biafra, obviously because of, they are unhappy with the state of things. Nigeria is food dragging. It improves sometimes and then goes back again. Infrastructurally, you see some improvements. Lagos just has now recently a speed train, so the decongestion is happening. But then, then the economic crashes. It's just, it's imbalanced. So some people, so those guys say, oh, well, he's in support of Biafra. And there are some people in the North who are worried about the book because it depicts the war in these very strong details. And by strong, I don't mean to praise it, but I mean, I don't want to use the word graphic, but vivid, details. So they're like, well, we don't want people to see this. So it's a mix of things. But my duty, I think, as a writer is to tell the stories, and I'm not necessarily, I can't control what people do about it, so I don't even know if I'm interested in the reactions. But I would say in general it's positive. What I've seen, what people have complained about is, we can't afford to buy your book. Because against my counsel, the Nigerian publishers came out with a hardcover, which I think is a bad idea. Now they are in print to do it because it's quite expensive, you see.
More questions? Yeah.
Okay, I'm getting mic training. Thank you. You mentioned earlier about the way Nigeria was formed and that it needed to find its identity because of the couple forming it. Given what happened during the war, how would you describe the national identity or characterization of the country? Was there a positive impact, negative impact on that national identity about what does it mean to be a Nigerian?
Yes, I think it actually did. I think it's a sort of it was a shock to the system because it was a very devastating war. So in some ways, Nigeria has not had any wars since then, and I think that it's unlikely that we would. Now, see, what I've discovered about wars is, in my view, again, because for many years I was just obsessed with trying to understand this human phenomenon, and while writing the novel, I think that there are different kinds of wars in terms of their effect. The one thing that is obviously, it's not my idea, it's a cliche, in fact, is that once a war begins, I think the tragedy is that it never really ends. The battle can end, but psychologically, it hangs there somewhere. You can make the case that the American Civil War, we still feel its repercussions today, in elections or whatnot. So it does not end. Same with the Second World War. So that's the case, obviously, for Biafra. But I do think that there are some wars that can reform a country in its aftermath. I would say Ukraine would be a good example of that. Before this war began, Ukraine was a very poor country, almost like just not an important place. But if you look at the situation now, of course, they're being destroyed. But Ukraine, if the war should stop now, it's a different country. It's become industrialized. Almost everywhere you find drone companies, because their back is pushed against the wall. When you want to survive, you are forced to develop. That's why if you look at the internet or America's industrialization, most of it came from military pressures. The First World War made Detroit this manufacturing hub. That was the case with Biafra. I'll give you an example. So during the war, Biafra was barricaded and was under intense bombing. British and Soviet Union were pumping bombs, and weapons into Nigeria. Yet Biafra had nothing. Biafrans, as I depict in the novel, sometimes you have a unit of 70 men and women, and they have about 40 rifles with very minimum ammunition. So they were literally being slaughtered, while the adversaries had tanks and cannons and whatnot. So, but what did they do? They had to manufacture weapons. In fact, at the beginning of the war, they had only 12 rifles in all of Biafra. Yes, that's more than a household in Alabama has, rifles. But they were building tanks. They built a refinery during this time. Do you know that 57 years on, Nigeria as a whole does not have a refinery? We just finished building one just like this year. But Biafra, as a rebel country, was refining its own oil. So if it had been allowed to survive, it would have been an industrialized country. But Nigeria, out of spite, blew up the refinery and then took 57 years to build one. So all of this is to say that the people, and why was Biafra so successful? Because under this pressure, it was because of that sense of identity. We are Igbos, we have the same language, we are unified in this vision that if we can form this country, it will be our own idea. It's not a foreign idea. And we will decide its fate rather than a British guy. So that energized people in a way that Nigeria's contraption has never been energized and cannot be, I don't think. So, of course, you can make the criticism that Biafra would have been an ethno-state and whatnot, but Sweden is an ethno-state. Norway, so are many countries. So that's a long-winded answer, I guess, but, all of this is to say that the Nigerian identity still doesn't exist in my view.
I think there's a question there.
Okay, well, thank you very much for giving me time. I know the previous session was very busy.
We're
But
not
again,
hearing
I pick,
the mic, sorry. Let's switch here. Just make
I pick on your word divide and rule. And I think that was obvious from the previous presentation here on Palestine and Israel. And Dr. Gokhale or Ms. Gokhale mentioned this also for India, that India was a very prosperous country one time. And Columbus wanted to discover all those spices, all those Ayurveda, whatever medicine this way, but he went in the wrong direction, and he found America. Now, always question comes to my mind, why it did not happen, divide and rule to America, and why it happened to India, Bangladesh, and so on, because Iranians used to call that the paradise in the nation. We heard about the paradise also in the morning. Now, one reason the British empire will never, sun will never set on the British Empire. That was the prism, and they came to this country too. Okay, so when
the question is not clear.
Huh?
Is this a comment or a question?
It's a comment and
All
a
right.
question.
So,
yeah,
because
yeah.
we
question, yeah, okay.
Lead us to the question.
Okay, comment is in this way: why didn't this division happen to America? Divide and rule, and one reason is they thought the people make the difference. People of India made the difference, people of Nigeria made the difference, and people of Israel, Palestine made the difference. When the 13 colonies met in Philadelphia, they had a common platform, and they didn't say we want to make a separate country.
Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. And then later on,
Sir, we have 2 or 3 more questions. So we got the hang of it.
Okay.
Let us get
I
it.
think I get the
so
gist
the
of your
question
question.
is then basically what you mentioned, why didn't it happen to America and happen to other countries? Both are ruled by the British Empire.
Thank you. Yeah, so well considered question. The sad thing is I'm not very knowledgeable about that much history of the U.S., I have to say. I just only became a U.S. citizen earlier this year, and so I have to catch up on my history. Yeah, after living here for 12 years. But I think that, from what I understand, again, the country was in some ways born out of a war, just as Biafra was, born out of. So the British had its sovereignty here, and then there was the War of Independence, which created America. So some war of resistance usually would birth, I guess, I don't know if I'm answering your question, but that would be my answer.
It's a good answer.
What else to say?
There's a question there, please.
I was fascinated by the quote you mentioned about like how the history of war should be told by both the living and the dead. So I'm curious to know, as a writer, how do you tell the story of the dead? What are your sources then, and how do you tell that story?
Well, I would recommend that you buy 3 copies of this book for yourself, for your best friend, for your significant other, and then you find out. Well, what I did was, actually, it's interesting to say this, but actually, this is a conglomeration of stories. There was a story that where the idea of Kunle dying actually did come from. It was not very original to me. My dad's best friend, whom I spoke about in passing earlier, told me a very interesting account that I will not forget. This was 1968, at the heat of the war. Biafra had lost about 30% of its territory. And this particular unit was facing probably the toughest of it's in the novel, some of the biggest battles in the book. The toughest unit of the Federals. They were getting mad that a war they thought was going to take 2 weeks was now dragging into the second year. So they pumped every possible weapons into this battle. And then this guy was leading a platoon. They've been shelled from like 5 a.m. to like 2 p.m. or something, relentlessly. And his second in command was struck by shrapnel. So they thought he was dead. They were there. Nobody could move or help him out or even check whether he was alive. This went on for like the entire day till the bombing stopped around like 10 p.m. So they went and looked at him. He was just lying there, in a pool of blood. So they left him. They went and looked for food. 2 days later, this guy walks up to them. The first thing they did was... something happened. Yeah. Oh, yeah, it's back, yeah. So they fled from him. They're like, guy, you're dead, But he came back and he was talking about being taken into this outer space where there's like all light and stuff, And he had this like mental thing. They had to take him out of the war into a psychiatry. But he actually died, and came back to life. So that's how, so he told the story in this place, in this other, universe or whatever.
Any more questions? I have one. First, I'd like to give the opportunity to the audience for what may be the last question. But if there's nobody, this gentleman talked about this also, and so did that lady in the last row. But conspiracy theories continue to circulate. Beyond the simmering tribal animosities and the brutalities of the civil war that followed were the shadows of the international battlefield for oil deposits and gas-rich terrain. And I read in a few places that actually this was a proxy war by many people who were interested in the gas deposits, which were mostly in Igbo country. Would you say something about that?
Yes, you always have those dynamics playing out. The thing with wars, I think, is that they are never about one thing. There's always parties that become very interested. One of the main characters in the novel is a French, an actual real-life character, a French mercenary called Rothsteiner. He was a sort of a proxy of France. So the French were really the only world power that supported Biafra during the war. But it was a covert support. They were using mercenaries and stuff. And they said to the president of Biafra at one time, if you want us to give you broader support, you have to sign an agreement where if you won the war, we'll mine your oil for 20 years. and he almost accepted, but then someone told him, look, you might think that these guys will mine maybe 100,000 barrels a day. They will bring the machinery to mine 1 million barrels a day. Before you know it, the oil deposit will be gone, even half the time. So that was what prevented Ojukwu from ceding, from accepting French actual support. So this is to say that there are often, of course, international allegiances that play in a sort of subterranean way in this war, but all other wars as well.
So we have 3 minutes left. Okay. And there's one question which I'm meant to ask you, and so I'm going to take it again upon myself. There's an enormous stream of literary work coming out of Nigeria, Ghana, other parts of Africa. Tell us how you assess and categorize this, and in 3 minutes.
Okay. Yeah, I tend to talk a lot. People often say this. I think that it is true that there's a certain level of visibility that work from Nigeria especially has gained over the last couple of decades. My sense is that, there's a rich, I think, as someone who has been teaching in the American system for 8 or 9 years now, I had a very good education, in Nigeria. So there's a stable middle class that has access to very good education, I think. I look at what some of my students, even in elite universities, like I taught at Wesleyan last year, know, and I could think that my education was comparable to that, even though, yes, I went to very good schools, and all of that. So I think that that's one of the things. But at the end of the day, I don't think that there's enough writers, given the number. Nigeria is 200 million people. You can actually count the number of writers that are quite visible on the global scene. I don't think that there are more than 20.
On that note,
So, yeah.
we will say that one of the great writers is visible here before my eyes. And let's give him a huge clap.